I have some very important news. Can you hear me now? So some of you were here in the very first Taubman presentation almost 30 years ago.
Go to the microphone.
Okay. How's that? I've forgotten how to do this. Thank you. So some of you were here in the very beginning, nearly 30 years ago. And today I did a sort of tabulation of all the people we've had. And our speaker today, James Diamond, is the 272nd person who has been brought here by the Taubman Endowment over that almost three-decade-long period of time. Now, I heard James Diamond, Professor James Diamond, speak a year ago, and I said, we have to invite him. And I'm so delighted that we were able to bring him from his home in Canada to Santa Barbara to tell us about a very, very important document that he has translated in a critical English translation that we're going to hear about. I also want to thank, on behalf of the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Endowment Symposia in Jewish Studies, our ongoing 30-year project of bringing Jewish studies to UC Santa Barbara and the Santa Barbara Jewish community. And we're also very grateful to the Jewish Federation, who is hosting us today, and would like to thank them. Now, our speaker today is really a scholar of Maimonides, not a scholar of the history of the Jews of the 20th century. And he said we can invite him back at any point in the future and he'll give us a lecture on Maimonides, but not today. He has a truly distinguished career. He's published over 30 scholarly articles and book chapters. He's explored Jewish thought widely, from the Bible to Maimonides to Harav Kook. Additionally, he has published 5 books, among them major prize winners, 4 of them delving deeply into the medieval world of Rambam, Maimonides. Most notably, Professor Diamond won the 2008 Association for Jewish Studies Jordan Schnitzer Book Award in the category of philosophy and Jewish thought, given for Diamond's book entitled Converts, Heretics, and Lepers, Maimonides and the Outsiders, which is a really thrilling book, in that it takes as its departure point ideas about Maimonides that are very contemporary, but also very important in terms of the Middle Ages. So please now welcome our colleague, Professor James Diamond.
Okay. Yep. Good. Okay, thank you very much, Richard. It's just wonderful to be here in this very, very warm Jewish community in Santa Barbara. It's just a beautiful place. I've never been here before. When I came out of my house in Toronto on Friday morning, I almost slipped right across my driveway on a sheet of ice and slipped all the way down here to the beautiful sun, beautiful beach, and just a very, very warm community, both in the environment and in the spiritual sense. I spent Shabbos in the Minyan here that Lee, I think, heads up, at least with he's the Balakore, beautiful Balakore. And if I had known about the Kiddush, I would have for sure have come. But it was a wonderful Kiddush as well. So I'm going to speak a little bit today, and by the way, I want to also echo my thanks to the Jewish Federation, to Richard and Lee for organizing the conference, to the Taubman family, who I believe Deborah Taubman represents, and is here with us today. And it's an honor to be the 272nd speaker, even though it took you that long to invite me, but it's okay. What you see on the board right now is the cover of my book that's apparently, according to publishers, needs another year, but okay, as long as it comes out before Mashiach comes, it should be okay. And so I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a taste of the core subject of this study, which I think is extraordinarily important, not just substantively for the thought of this person I'm going to talk about, but for Jewish history, for Jewish life today. I think especially for Jewish life today. And as you see, it's called Confronting Divine Rage, Sermons from the Warsaw Ghetto. I'm going to explain a little bit what that word rage means. The story about the Hasidic Rebbe that I'm going to talk about is embedded in a much larger story that is also quite a spectacular story of resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. So when most people think about, when you mention the Warsaw Ghetto, most people immediately think of the armed uprising. And of course, that was an extremely important, heroic event. Far less known is what I call also resistance of equal value, although it wasn't armed resistance. It was, one could call it spiritual resistance of a group of approximately 50 to 60 writers, diarists, artists, historians that came together under the tutelage of this Jewish historian called Emanuel Ringelblum. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this name, who lived between 1900 and 1944. The dates, of course, 39 to 45 are important because whenever I hear a Jew in Eastern Europe died between those dates, it's most likely not a natural death. And so he was a member of the left Polei Zion. He worked for the joint distribution, and started kind of soup kitchens in the ghetto. It was called in Yiddish, Allein Hilf, helping yourself. And what he decided to do was to develop a group of people whose mission would be to record through the talent that they had, whatever talent it was, to record whatever it is they saw or heard in the Warsaw Ghetto, and record that either in diaries, in art, in history. And this was their mission. It was called the Oyneg Shabbos Group. In modern Hebrew, that would be Oneg Shabbat. It was called the Oyneg Shabbos Group because most certainly that was what they would call themselves. These were mainly Yiddish speakers. There were, of course, many Zionists. It was made up of many isms: socialism, Marxism, Zionism, all the isms you can think of, but they came together in this mission. And so why this is important is because the armed uprising was, of course, very important and heroic, although it was never meant to succeed in anything. It was meant to go down fighting. Nobody had any pretensions that we could defeat the German army, right? They had, it's astounding what they had. A couple of machine guns, most homemade Molotov cocktails, very, very little actual weapons. And they managed to hold off the Germans, the Nazis, for about a month. But there was no pretension that we'll be able to defeat the German army. What the Oyneg Shabbos Group managed to do was to leave us approximately 35,000 pages of documents of all kinds of things that were discovered after the war. So what they did was to, under the kind of leadership of Ringelblum, was to bury these documents in archives, and they buried them in a series of burials, two of which we were able to exhume after the war. One remains undiscovered, and who knows where it is. It might be, some people speculate that it might be under the Chinese embassy right now. Good luck with that. So, fortunately, I use these words fortunately and miraculously very loosely when we talk about Jewish life under World War II, and especially Jewish life in the Warsaw Ghetto. Only 3 people from that group survived. However, fortunately, I'm going to stay away from the word miraculously because that has too many theological connotations. One of them happened to be the main confidant of Ringelblum, who was the only one besides Ringelblum who knew where these things were buried. A couple named Hirsch and Hirsch Wasser, and another woman, Ruchel Auerbach, who went on to be a professional historian, worked for Yad Vashem many, many years, and there recently become out a book on her life and her writings. So as you can see, there were 2 caches of documents. One you can see on your left side of about 10 tin boxes, which gave us about 25,000 documents, or 25,000 or so. The second cache, which was discovered a few years afterwards, and this was fairly recent after the war, one right after the war and one in 1950. And so, like I said, it gives us this unbelievable, rich treasure of documents that reflect every aspect of life in the Warsaw Ghetto over the course of the years that these people managed to live before most of them were either deported to the killing grounds of Treblinka, or murdered during the uprising, or afterwards. We're talking about, it was an underground press, poetry, diaries, photographs, art, artifacts, posters, even candy wrappers, just to reflect what life was like. And so here you have them, like a picture of them actually discovering the documents and exhuming them. When I started to look into this story, and there is a wonderful, wonderful book, probably the best thing ever to read about this, by a guy named Samuel Kassow, who's a wonderful scholar, who wrote a book called Who Will Write Our History? So anything you want to know about the general Oinig Shabbos group, that's the book to go to. He does deal very peripherally with the guy I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to focus on one particular document that was found, fortunately, in this treasure of the documents that the Oinig Shabbos group left us. So, in that cache of documents, we're not quite sure how it got there, but it got there. He wasn't a card-carrying member of this group. He was a Hasidic, not rabbi, but a rebbe. Maybe some of you might know the difference. Anyways, a rebbe is the central figure of a Hasidic community, a small community. His name was Kalonymus Kalmish Shapira, known, as many of the Rebbes were known, after the city that they kind of operated in or where their community was based, the Piaseczner Rebbe. Piaseczno is still around. It's a small suburb, very close to Warsaw. He came from a very long line, very distinguished line of kind of a Hasidic dynasty that stretches all the way back to one of the kind of pioneers of Hasidism called the Chayze of Lublin, the seer of Lublin. I'm not going to go too much into his kind of background. He lost his father when he was 3 years old. He was actually raised by the grandson of his father, because he was a product of his father's second marriage, who had already had grandkids, and so he became a community leader of, like I said, a fairly small group. However, what was notable about him is that he founded a yeshiva, a rabbinical college in Warsaw, called, again, I'm not going to pronounce it the way modern Hebrew would be. It would be in modern Hebrew, Da'at Moshe, but it was Das Moshe. And so what is interesting is that this yeshiva, even though it was founded, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of this rabbinical college, and even though it was a very, very tiny community, it was the second largest yeshiva in Poland. So that's a credit to his notoriety as a pedagogue. He published one book. There was one book published before the war, which was basically a book about pedagogy, called Chovat HaTalmidim, Chovas HaTalmidim, the obligation of students, which was kind of a primer on how to teach young people Torah, and Chassidut in particular. And this may not be kind of new to us, but he wasn't a big fan of the slap a kid method, the pachin punim, as we would say. He was into more modern, progressive ways of educating people. He most certainly was familiar with modern pedagogy, modern methods of pedagogy, and because of that, many people were attracted to his yeshiva, and it became the largest one. Now again, when we're talking about large yeshivot, people now, my colleagues in the Orthodox community, who I'm very close, I was raised in the Orthodox community, went to yeshiva myself, they think that everybody went to yeshiva in Eastern Europe, and it was like if those of you who know Lakewood, where you have thousands of students. Anybody who knows, if I was to mention perhaps the Harvard of Eastern European yeshivot, would be Volozhin, the one in Volozhin in Lithuania. At any one time, the largest volume of students in registration would be about 300, right? I know from my own father, who came from a family of 10, and he was the oldest. When he was 14, he had to go out and work, right? And you had very stringent admission requirements that you needed to go through to get into these yeshivot. And so it was for the elite. And his yeshiva was a very successful one. And as I said, it was a credit to his embrace of how to accommodate students. And as he says in the book, he says the mission is not information. It's not really to convey information. Anybody can do that. It is to unleash the potential of each particular student. And it's the duty of every great educator to know his student, know the particular student he's talking to, and as I said, cultivate the potential that he sees in that particular student. And so somehow his text, which was a series of sermons that he continued to deliver in the Warsaw Ghetto from the time the Nazis invaded Poland in September of 1939 to the summer, July of 1942, when the Great Deportations started, which basically emptied out the ghetto of virtually everybody except for a small cadre of thousands of people that the Germans decided they still need to work for them in kind of slave labor. Almost every week, you're talking about 2.5 years, from the September of 1939 to the summer of 1942. We have these sermons, which he orally delivered in Yiddish. Most certainly that would have been the way it was done, as is customary with all Hasidic literature. And he would subsequently write them down and record them for posterity. As I said, we're not quite sure how it got to, this is a picture of him and his son, Elimelech Ben Sion. It may be, but it's no longer the case now that scholars have dug into this. One of his cousins, actually, was a card-carrying member of the Oynik Shabbos group, a man named Shimon Huberbrand, who was perhaps one of the only religious Orthodox members of this group, who actually left us also a book, which is interesting, called Kiddush Hashem, which is a record of the way people sacrificed themselves to continue religious observance during this horrific period of oppression and ultimate death. So he's interesting just to mention because of that. Most likely is not the connection, because he was taken away and murdered, and we know that Rabbi Shapira continued to revise his sermons after his death. So let me get to how we got this. Well, we know how we got it. He appended to his sermon, right, that was handed over to the Oynik Shabbos group that got buried. It was found in the second cache of documents, in those milk crates that you saw at the beginning. And he appended 2 letters. One letter to any outsiders that might find this. And this is an actual copy. This is the copy, right? His handwriting of the letter. Headed by Of Merkison, for those who know Yiddish, attention, attention. Whoever finds this, I have a bit of the translation on the side. I have the honor of requesting the esteemed individual or institution that finds my writings, my enclosed writings, and there were other writings that he was working on, aside from these sermons. Other writings having to do with pedagogy, with Hasidic theology, and he mentions those, and the weekly readings for the calendrical years, the Hebrew calendrical years, 5700, Tafshin, Tafshin Aleph, Tafshin Beit, 5701, 5702. To please, whoever finds this, please exert themselves to send them to the land of Israel, to the following address: Rabbi Yeshaya Shapira, his brother. Now this is fascinating too. Tel Aviv, Palestine, no street address. Please also send the enclosed letter. When the Blessed One will show mercy, and I and the remaining Jews survive the war, please return all materials to me or to the Warsaw Rabbinate for Colonimus. And may God have mercy upon us, the remnant of Israel in every place. He would virtually end off everything he said with this: rescue us and sustain us and save us, keheref ayin, in the blink of an eye, which of course never happened, with deep, helpful gratitude. Now this is fascinating because this is a very, I don't like the term ultra-Orthodox, but we'll use this term. It's kind of a term when in Rome. A very Haredi family, a very Hasidic family. However, the brother who he's addressing this to, Rabbi Yeshaya Shapira, made Aliyah to Eretz Israel, to Israel, in 1914. This is highly, highly unusual. He became known as, in Israel, very well known, as Ha'admor, which means the way you address a Hasidic Rebbe, Admor, which means Adonenu, Morenu. You may hear, for instance, the Lubavitch Rebbe, they say the Admor. That means our master, our teacher. They called him Admor HaChalutz, the pioneering rabbi. He was known as that. He became a founder of Poel HaMizrahi, the socialist wing of the Mizrahi party, of the Orthodox Mizrahi. He was the president for a few years. He actually started a bank called Zerubbabel Bank, which unfortunately went bust. And in 1942, basically sold everything and became a farmer in a small village. And he died, unfortunately, before the war ended, had no idea what happened to his brother. His brother had no idea what happened to him. Very tragic in terms of their own relationship. But fascinating figure, who only recently, a young guy in Israel, just recently last year, did a PhD on him as well. So we have a lot of information about him. However, he appended another letter, which was to his brother inside, right? Aside from the letter addressed to whoever finds this, there was another letter addressed personally to his brother. And here is where the title comes from, which you saw the title of my book, Confronting Divine Rage. I ask of you, my beloved and dear ones, that once God helps, and the essays, Chidushei Torah, from the years of rage. Here is where he adds his own title, I would say a kind of a non-title title. It's a descriptive title of the events that he's engulfed in during those years, called Za'am. Za'am, that's rage. And make an effort to publish them either collectively or singly as your good judgment sees fit. The words of your loving friend and brother who yearns for you, who is broken and shattered with his own torments and the torments of all the Jewish people. It's almost hard for me to, whenever I read this, to keep my own emotions back, which are as deep as the manifold abyss and as high as the heavens, who anticipates God's salvation again, Keherif Ayin, in the blink of an eye. Kalonimus. His request is that the printing of his writings bear his personal plea and exhortation that each and every Jew study my works. Now, this isn't a ploy, a PR move to sell books, right? This is a compulsion that is shared by many, many writers, not just a religious Orthodox thinker like him, but it cuts across the Oinik Shabbos group, it cuts across, and I have here kind of quotes from different writers, secular writers. So, and you can see the same compulsion that motivates them to write, even though they well know that they may not live to see the publication of their works. One you may know, well, one for sure, I'm sure all of you know Elie Wiesel. Each one of us felt compelled to record every story, every encounter. Each one of us felt compelled to bear witness. Such were the wishes of the dying, the testament of the dead, since the so-called civilized world had no use for their lives, then let it be inhabited by their deaths. And Primo Levi, I would say, along with Elie Wiesel, the other greatest writer of Holocaust literature, including leaving us account like Night, called Survival in Auschwitz, which is not the name he gave it to. I commend these words to you. Listen to what he says. And he's an atheist. He was an atheist before the war, he remained an atheist in the war, and he remained an atheist after. He was a scientist, and he remained a chemist in a paint factory for the years until most likely he committed suicide, which was a common casualty, particularly among intellectuals, which is a whole other lecture. He starts his book, some of you might note where this is from. This is an atheist. I commend these words to you, carve them in your hearts, at home, in the street, going to bed, rising, repeat them to your children, or may your house fall apart. May illness impede you. May your children turn your faces from you. Now again, this is not a ploy to sell books. This is a overwhelming, obsessive compulsion to record what I saw. You must know this, or may your children, now this is loosely playing on the Shema, B'shinantam levanecha, right? B'shach b'kov kumecha, and this is an atheist. It's a bit subversive, but he's taking that and he's saying the new teaching is this. So a bit about Claude Lanzmann, maybe we'll talk about him later. Zam, the word Zam. So I think, why did he choose Zam? Zam is not a unique word. It occurs numerous times in Tanakh, numerous times in rabbinic literature to describe catastrophic periods of time, like the destruction of the temple. But I think there's a couple of unique ways that it's employed in Tanakh that I think captures what he's trying to say, the rage. So I have two, and there are others. One from Ezekiel, one from Lamentations. You have it in the Hebrew, I'll just read the English. And I sought a man, God speaking, among them to repair the wall or to stand in the breach before me, God, in behalf of this land, that I may not destroy it. But I found none. I have therefore poured out my indignation upon them. I will consume them with fire of my rage. So God is saying, my rage will consume you all, unless there is a human being who will stand in the breach and protect you from my rage. I think, I don't know if this went off, I'm not sure. I think that that's the sense that he's using this. He is the man that is assuming the mantle that will be the barrier between his people and God's rage. That is the role that I think Za'am actually conveys about the Rebbe. Because as I read these sermons over and over again, I realized there's more than one audience. There's two audiences. There's a horizontal audience, which is his community, who he's sermonizing to, who he's shepherding, who he's acting as a rabbi should, trying to comfort them with his sermons, but they're also addressed to God. And Hasidic theology, Kabbalistic theology, believes that the Rebbe, or the person who kind of is a bridge between this world and the upper world, can actually change God's mind, can impact on God, and I think these sermons are meant to do that. That's one sense of rage. The other sense is captured in Lamentations by, Lamentations, of course, the famous book about the destruction of the first temple. In his raging anger, using the word Zam, he, God, spurned priest and king alike, meaning that Zam also captures the idea that it is indiscriminate. It doesn't discriminate between the righteous and the non-righteous, the sinners and the tzaddikim, the important people and the non-important people. There's no discrimination here. The rage that is happening is targeting everybody indiscriminately. And that is, I think, the reason he pointedly chose this term as the title of his book. This is actually a page. I just took kind of a photo of a page from the original manuscript. As you can see, it kind of captures, it's almost dizzying when you look at it. It's very hard to make out the script. His hand was already weak, we know that. And he's crossing out things. He's got gloss, which is when you really need to stop to think about this, because here's a guy, and I didn't mention this yet, they're all starving to death. All these people in the Oyek Shabbos group, they're starving to death. They've lost members of their family, and they continue to write. He continues to revise his sermons even after they end their oral delivery in the summer of 1942. We know that he continues to revise them, continues to cross out things, continues to add notes. Hopefully I'll get to a couple of very, very interesting ones where he actually shows and notes that he's changed his mind, which is an extraordinary admission for a rabbi, to say I was wrong, I would say for anybody. For scholars, for sure, to say I was wrong. That's not something I've encountered too much among my colleagues, something that maybe they should learn from. But this is just a kind of an example of, here's, actually, that's my hand. When I went to Poland, we had a number of years ago a little conference in Poland dedicated to this Hasidic Rebbe, with other people who have written about him, other people in Chassidut, other people, scholars of Kabbalah, other historians. It's held in the Jewish Historical Institute in Poland, taken very good care of. So if anybody tells you there's all kinds of myths about it, some guy came from the Jewish agency and discovered them and brought them back to Israel, license, as they say. It's there, I saw it. I would just say, from my own personal perspective, it's the holiest object I ever held in my hands, the most sacred object. Until now, we did have an edition called the Eish Kodesh. So until now, those who have studied his works, and they become a little bit more and more popular. There is a line of his dynasty now carried through his brother in Israel. So there is now a Piasetzner Rebbe through his brother. That is I think the great-grandson of the Admor HaChalutz. That is now the Piasetzner Rebbe in Beit Shemesh. So the Hasidim, when they got a hold of a microfilm of the manuscript, they published a manuscript based on that. They called it themselves Eish Kodesh, which is not what he called it. It's the Sermons from the Years of Rage, much more appropriate title, and also his own title. We now have a new edition. Nobody can any longer use the old edition. I mean, it's fine, but it served its purpose. There's a new edition by a young, wonderful scholar who lives in Israel of Chassidut, one of, I think, most prominent scholars of Chassidut today, a guy named Daniel Reiser, a wonderful, wonderful person, human being, who spent years with the manuscript itself and published a new manuscript that particularly takes note of all the revisions, which the old one didn't. I want to introduce you to. So here you have, for instance, a revision. Just an example. I actually decided to have a whole chapter in my book on this. You notice there's lines that strike. This is a strike through of an entire sermon. An entire sermon. There's 4 of them, 4 strike throughs. But fortunately, we can still see the original one. I decided to, I'm not sure, I don't think any, as far as I know, nobody has done this yet, to explore why he may have deleted these sermons. I don't have time to go into it. It's kind of a little bit complex to understand the sermon itself and then to kind of understand why he would have deleted them. But it's a fascinating, I mean, he left us a record of his original drasha, and then he crossed it out. When you read the old edition, they left in the old drasha without any notation that he crossed it out. So I'm not accusing them of anything ill will or anything. They just decided to put it in, but you wouldn't know that he actually decided to cross it out. Reiser, in his new edition, leaves it out. He makes a notation, but he provides in a second volume a complete facsimile of the original manuscript, so you can kind of check it out. So what I would like to do is go to one retraction. That is, I think, what I was referring to before. A retraction that is, I think, extraordinarily unique. Time-bound, and gives us a window into his evolving perspectives, theological perspectives. Because again, this is a man who is, to use a cliche, God intoxicated, right? His whole life is, he lives and breathes not just the Bible, but the entire rabbinic tradition, right? Rabbinic literature, the Talmud, Kabbalistic literature, Hasidic theology. He lives and breathes this, and that's important when I'm talking about this particular point in his evolving perspective as to what's going on. I missed something I was going to mention here, which is important. Immediately with the initial bombing of the army, his son, his daughter-in-law, his sister-in-law, and his mother all died. His mother actually died a natural death, but at the same time, all were killed in the initial bombing. That's his only son, and he lost his daughter too. His daughter disappeared, was taken away in some deportation off the street. In Hanukkah, in December of 1941, he says the following: "It is true that trials such as we are enduring now come only once every few centuries. In any case, how can they help us understand the current acts of God? When one learns a verse, Talmud or Midrash, and hears of the suffering of Jews from earlier times, how did faith remain intact? Yet nowadays faith is weakened. The people who say that trials such as these never existed in Jewish history are in error." This is December of 1941. What of the destruction of the temple? The fall of Beitar, which is kind of the last breath during the last Bar Kokhba revolt in 130s to 135, when afterwards there's no hope anymore. But these become the classic historical paradigms which rabbis responded to, and that future rabbis draw on those responses to address catastrophes, whether it is the Crusades or whether it's the Khmelnytsky massacres. You would draw on these rabbinic responses to, let's say, the destruction of the temple. So that's what he's saying here. We've experienced this before. We have the tools, meaning the theological tools, not the weapons. The Rebbe was not, trained, in how to use a machine gun, but he was trained with these instruments. And these are the instruments he would use to respond to the theological crisis that such catastrophe raised. Now, here we go. So, there. So, at the end of 1942, right, almost a year later, he goes back to this sermon. Again, you really have to imagine a guy who's lost his entire family, his only 2 children. He doesn't have a wife. His wife died before the war. His mother's not around. And his community is no longer around. There's nobody to talk to anymore. And he continues to go back to his sermons, look them over, right? And he goes back to this sermon, and he says the following, and he adds, as kind of an asterisk, he actually has the wherewithal to provide us with a kind of a legend of notation marks that tells you when I want you to actually delete this when you actually publish it, or keep the original and publish my corrective note. And he publishes this, he adds this: "The monstrous torments, the terrible and freakish deaths which the malevolent murderers invented against us, the house of Israel, from that point on," meaning the middle of 1942, "according to my knowledge of rabbinic literature and Jewish history in general, that there has never been anything like them." This is, by the way, this is not just, this is extraordinary. And so what I think is, you have to parse these words. "Lefi yediati v'divrei chachamenu zichronom levracha." according to my knowledge of rabbinic literature, however, it's not just like that. According to my knowledge of rabbinic literature, b'divrei hayamim asher Yisrael, and in the history of Israel, meaning it's utterly unique what we're going through. What I said in Hanukkah, December 920 is wrong. It's wrong. And I tried to comfort you, and it's wrong. That's an unbelievable admission, because what it does is he's admitting that I'm shorn of my toolbox. I don't have the theological toolbox to deal with this, with the scope, right, of this catastrophe. And so that's one. I have a few others, but unfortunately, I'm not going to get to those. Let me just go to the end. Right, Richard?
Yes.
Okay. So alongside, I mean, we have other diaries from the Warsaw Ghetto. I thought it would be interesting. You know, after July of 1942, his sermons stop, right? They stop at that date. He continues to revise them, but there's no longer anybody to give sermons to. There was the leader of the Judenrat. It was a guy named Adam Chernyakov. I think it's a very, very tragic story. I know there's all kinds of complexity about this issue. However, this is a tragic figure. I think a guy who honestly felt, also who had no idea Jews never dealt with this kind of thing before. Jews always had dealt with their oppressors or the governments that be. You know, strike a deal, make the best deal you can, not knowing that this is not what they're in store for. This is not what the Nazis wanted. And he kept a diary, actually, always. And he realized until the end, when they started exactly around the same time, July 1942, when the sermons stopped, the great deportations start, and they tell Chernyakov, we need a product. We need 7,000 people a day, or whatever it was, to deport to the killing grounds of the concentration camps. And he tries to plead with them. He tries to say, can we exclude the orphans? Can we exclude the children? No, you can talk about that after the war. We need no discrimination. So he actually, the last note that he's reputed to have written before committing suicide, he realized that this is not a job. I mean, what use am I? I thought I was useful. I thought I can somehow keep this community alive. They are demanding that I kill the children of my people with my own hands. There's nothing for me to do but die. And he actually committed suicide. He's actually buried in the cemetery. I suppose one of the lucky ones to actually have a burial site, but not really lucky in an overall sense. He's actually buried in the large cemetery in Warsaw, in the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw. There is another, and so here is what I wanted to, two things I want to end off with, promise. One is the young teenager that was commissioned, who was charged with burying one of the caches, one of the volumes of documents, named David Graeber. This is what he said, and we have his note that was in the Weinig Shabbos group that they buried when they buried all these documents. What we were unable to cry and shriek out to the world, we buried in the ground. I would love to see the moment in which the great treasure will be dug up and scream the truth at the world, so the world may know all. So the ones who did not live through it may be glad. We may feel like veterans with medals on our chests. May the treasure fall into good hands. May it last into better times. May it alarm and alert the world. August 3rd, 1942, which is when they buried the first cache of documents. David Graeber, age 19, who unfortunately did not survive the war. And I just want to leave you with something that is of equal effect, not as a text. This to me is just really says a lot, and I'll end with this. appended to one of the books that he was editing that had nothing to do with the sermons, but books that were about Hasidic theology, how to teach pedagogy. In the cover, he had a signature, right? So what you see on top is his signature, Kalonimus Kalmish, his name, Kalonimus Kalman, Ben Harav HaKodesh Morenu Harav Elimelech, the son of our master, our Holy One, Elimelech, who he named his son after, Zecher Tzaddik, may it be for righteous memory, the Kadosh L'chai Olam Haba, that's his name, and then crossed out. Now, what he crossed out, we now know, we can see actually, Reiser was able to kind of use some methods to see through this, is his title, his official communal title, which was not just as a Hasidic Rebbe, but the head of the rabbinic court of Piasetzno. What he crossed out was Av de Beit Din Po Piasetzno, the head of the rabbinical court here in the city of Piasetzno. He crossed it out. He crossed it out because there's no longer a rabbinic court, there's no longer a community, there's no longer Piasetzner Hasidim, there's no longer anybody to give his sermons to, and he actually crossed it out. And so I think maybe because of that, it's, I think, mandatory on all of us to at least be familiar with this story, to maybe look up once in a while. There is an English translation, actually, of the sermons by a guy named Warch, W-R-C-H. I'm not going to give my opinion, but it's serviceable. Scholars love to nitpick at things, right? But it's a serviceable, and it's, for those who don't know Hebrew, I would say you could take a look at those sermons. And there is a wonderful book that was written by somebody as a PhD in the late 80s called Nehemiah Poland, called The Holy Fire, who didn't have the benefit of the new edition or the manuscript, really. And so it's also a wonderful person who's still around, who teaches at Hebrew College in Boston. And so I would say to read, to continue to be familiar with the story, the Oinik Shabbos group, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, his sermons, is maybe to revive, in some sense, we'll never be able to revive it, in some sense, the spirit of his life and the spirit of the community that we have lost. Thank you very much.
So I believe that we have plenty of time for questions or comments, but we only have one microphone. And normally someone would run this microphone around to get you on the tape, but I have a better suggestion. I'm going to ask Jim to rephrase your question so that all of us can hear it, and it will be on the video. So that means we have to ask very direct questions. We will have time to talk with him about any of our thoughts about the manuscript and what he's been doing with it, its interpretation, immediately after we're finished, because we have a nice reception from the Federation. So is that okay if you repeat?
Yeah.
So who would like to start? Professor Zipperstein.
Yeah.
Two things. A, how do we know who did the deletions? How do we know for sure it was him? And B, were any of these documents available during communist rule in Poland?
Yeah, so Stephen is asking, how do we know who did the deletions? And were these documents available during communist Poland? So to answer your second question first, the Jewish Historical Institute is there, and it was there before the war. As a matter of fact, Emanuel Ringelblum was connected to it in some sense. He had written some historical articles about Polish Jewry, and they pretty well had a free hand. I don't think, as far as I know, I could be wrong, the communists didn't get too involved. I mean, this is kind of esoteric work. I don't think, nothing was really published in a sense. They had been busy. I think just recently they issued like many volumes of the Ringelblum archives. You actually can get it now. And I think you can actually get it online. So you can look up the catalog. So I don't think it was a problem. And they've taken, as far as I can see, very good care of it, which is interesting. Most of the people, I think all of them, are not Jewish, but they're expert historians of Polish Jewry, and especially what happened during World War II. When I was there was a guy who's a Polish scholar who became an expert in Chassidut, and he gave us a lecture, and it was just, I'm not sure about how deeply he can get into the thought, but in terms of an anthropological social historian, he knew exactly, from the hundreds of groups, he knew exactly the dress. This one wore white socks, this one wore socks that were over the pants, this wore socks that covered your pants, whatever. Very, and they take excellent care. So it continues to be there. I don't think there were ever any problems. Now, as far as the deletion, I don't know who else would have done that. I mean, I don't think anybody else was able to tamper with this manuscript. No, it wasn't in anybody else's possession between him and the time it was handed over to the Onyx group. And it doesn't make sense to me that anybody would have gone through these sermons at all and nitpicked this, so it was him. Some of the revisions we know, he actually has the date that he did these revisions. The strike-throughs we're not 100% sure, but it was for sure after the sermon's end. Yeah?
You said that he changed his mind about the Shoah as the biggest. Did he add any theological explanations?
So that's an excellent question. So your name? Itzik. So Itzik asked, he admitted that this is unique. Did he change his theological perspectives? I think by the time he adds this note, it's probably, from a practical point of view, it's a bit late to start revamping everything. But it is an interesting question. And there are, unfortunately I don't have time to get into this, but there are sermons. So, in response to your question, this is what I would say. The sermons are not a systematic treatise. I'm a mainly philosopher, and I'm used to kind of a logical, evolving treatise that has a thesis and that, is systematic and works its way towards certain conclusions. That's not what this is. This is an existential struggle from week to week. And so there is no ultimate solution. If you're looking for solutions, this is not the place to look. And at times, very many times, he offers old solutions. It's for sin. It's because we're not good Jews. Yes, because this is his life's blood. But then there are other times when he completely rejects that. There are other times when he's literally kind of yelling at God that this has to stop. I don't have enough time to deal with that. So there are places where he revises without the actual corrective note, where he's saying, in a sense, that the tools that I have are not adequate to deal with this catastrophe. Yeah.
Thank you. Could you give us some broader context of how this particular author compared to the cache itself? Was it 1%, 10%? What was the kind of general sense of the documents that they buried?
So to give you exact amounts, this is a very small. No, I could get this is very small. So this manuscript consisted of approximately 100 pages. 100 pages of what I showed you before, which turns out to be more when you actually publish the material in a book. When in terms of pages of documents that we have in the Oynek Shabbos, it's a minuscule percentage, 35,000 pages. So this is but you know it's unique in the sense that nothing else in there is doing what this Rebbe does, and nothing else is recording actual sermons that he's giving to his community in, let's say, shul, you want to call it that, whatever, on likely Friday nights. Friday nights is probably when he was giving them, and so that's the ratio in the overall context. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. First of all, my name is Corey Weiss. This Oynek Shabbos group is fascinating. I have a two-part question. One is, what previous or prior persecution of Jews potentially gave them the idea to create a cache, that it would even be a snowball's chance for it to be discovered? Like, where did they get that idea? And then secondly, you said that 2 of the 3 caches were recovered, but do you believe there had been dozens or hundreds of caches that existed that just never were recovered?
No. We know that there were 3.
But like from other groups, whether
we know that there were actually, so we've recovered, for instance, other diaries that weren't part of this group. So there were other writers. There's a guy named Chaim Kaplan. Some of you might be familiar, called Scroll of Agony, Megillat Yisurim. That we have, but this is this group, this particular group where this text was found in. Where they got the idea, I think it's. I don't think they needed necessarily precedent. I don't think you had. What was happening in the ghetto? I mean, we have a long history of ghettos, but not ghettos that are set up to kill people, right? To actually. Gather people up to ultimately kill them, and they knew this was going to happen. They ultimately knew this was going to happen. So I think the compulsion was almost sui generis. This was they knew that this is not ending well. We're not going to be around. This is what's going to remain of us. So that would be my answer to you. We have had people. Creating responses. We have all kinds of responses. For instance, even people in concentration camps leaving stuff buried with the same compulsion. Some of you might be familiar with some of those. Most famous are the Sonderkommando, the guys who actually cleaned out the gas chambers. So we have some record from those guys buried in bottles in Auschwitz. That were recovered after the war. So it's not I don't think it needed, it's a kind of intuitive compulsion that they had, knowing what was going on and knowing what was ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry if you mentioned this, but I got here a little late. You said his family was killed in the bombings. What happened to the Rebbe? And did he go, was he sent to a camp? And if so, did he lead services or give sermons while in a camp?
Yeah, so I didn't get to that, and that's a good question. Meaning, what happened to the Rebbe ultimately? Obviously, he didn't survive. And so, again, we don't know 100% because there are no burial sites for millions of Jews. What most likely happened, according to people who have tried to knit this together, was that ultimately after the uprising, he was still in the ghetto after the uprising, and there was a mass deportation at some point after April of 1943 to a transit camp that was a training camp for SS guards in Poland called Troniki, the Tronitsky camp, right? He most likely, so that was a transit camp on the way that Jews were deported. They would stop there and then ultimately make their way to the killing grounds of Treblinka, most likely, or other camps. There was, at this point later in the war, probably the largest mass murder of Jews in the history of the war at that camp. Instead of transporting Jews from that camp, they decided to kill them all. And about 25,000 were killed en masse. And most likely, that's how he met his end, in that mass execution. But again, we don't know 1,000%, but most likely, that's how he came to his end. Yeah.
You made some reference about, there was a reference from Ezekiel
Yeah.
and from Ecclesiastes, but was there a sense, kind of a chronology of what his sermons were based on? What was it based on? Is there a chronology? Was it the Parshiot, or was it? I mean, he did these sermons, I imagine, once a week. You said on Fridays. What did he draw his basis and inspirations, or was he just random academic thoughts about his vast knowledge,
Right.
Jewish history and Hasidim?
Right. So, yeah,
So
sorry.
was there a kind of a progression or a chronology of thought that occurred in the 2-3 years that he was there?
Yeah. So I'll just rephrase concisely, I think, what you're saying. On what did the Rebbe base his, what were the sermons based on? What substantively, I guess. So the answer would be that they are based loosely on the Parsha of the week. So, for the sake of history, we can chronologically date the sermons, like I said, December of 1941, Pesach of 1940. We know that sermon was delivered at that point. What we now know is also that we can't just relate what he said in that parsha to that particular date, because he revised stuff and he put glosses. So you have to take into consideration, right? So the chronology is not exactly linear, but the fodder, right, would be the parsha of the week. Now you asked a good question, right? Very often, as Rebbes, and anybody who's familiar with rabbinic thought, would start maybe with a verse, but then go off, right? Then go off. So the conceit would be, here's a verse, right? Here's the problem, right? Some grammatical problem, some textual problem, some chronological problem. Problems for rabbis are always opportunities, right? They're opportunities to develop thought. They're jumping off points. And so they'll go off and maybe not stick to the actual parsha, maybe sometimes actually work their way through a problem within the parsha. But the chronology would be the parsha of the week from, actually the first one is Shabbat Shuvah in September of 1939, once the initial bombings happened. What's interesting, and so they would follow for 2.5 cycles of readings throughout the year. So each one, right? Shemot, 1940, right? Vayechi, 1939, whatever it is. So
they were the lectures or the sermons were annotated with those references, Shemot 1940?
Yeah, well, annotated. They're not annotated, but he would cite the verse.
Okay.
Yeah.
He would cite a verse that would...
Right, so he doesn't annotate it himself. As a matter of fact, what's interesting is we know, the amount of knowledge these people had. I've read other rabbinic texts. This is not the age of computers or anything, but he didn't have any books with him. So very often he says, he cites something wrong, right? It's not exactly, the verse isn't exactly or it's saying from the Talmud, and he says, I'm not quite sure, you know, I don't have any books, right? So that would be the general answer, I think, to your question there. Yeah.
So you were mentioning that the rabbi vacillated between extreme religiosity as the cause of what was going on versus perhaps questioning.
Yes.
Could you tell whether there's a syndrome that changed in time? And did he actually stay with religiosity, or did he actually start focusing on this is wrong?
So, you know, it's hard. Did everybody hear that question? What you're asking is that you said that I said that you know, he gave kind of traditional religious responses.
A progression.
Is there a progression in time? I would say again, as following up on the way I described the sermons, as an existential struggle. I would say it depended on the week. It depended on what he was going through in the week. And like I said, it's not a systematic treatise. Some of the things he says at the end, particularly in the last couple of sermons, particularly in the last sermon, in the very last sermon. The very last sermon is Shabbat Chazon, which is the Shabbat named after the first word of the Haftarah of the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av, which is interesting. That's the last one. Is an extraordinary one that would respond to what you're asking in terms of saying, I give up on a lot of, not give up on religion, not give up on faith. Some of my colleagues, I'll have to say my own opinion. Some of my colleagues have the chutzpah to say that he lost his faith. I find that, as I said, first of all, chutzpahdik. Second of all, why would he do this? I mean, why would he continue to revise these sermons, to plead with his brother, to publish them, to tell people just don't be religious anymore? I mean, this is, you know, the guy is speaking to God all the time. No matter what you want to say, it might be that he doesn't find answers sufficient anymore, but that itself, you know, we know that in the history of responses to suffering in Yiddishkeit, in Judaism, is a kind of conversation, struggle, debates with God. I think kind of unique to Jewish, to Midrashic responses, to rabbinic responses in the Talmud, all the way through to a Midrash like Elie Wiesel gives us, or that even Primo Levi gives us. And so it's hard to say, you know, a progression, did he lose? You know, this was, the sermons, or what he said there, are his way of holding on to some kind of covenant that needs readjusting.
Let's have Rabbi Yudovit have the second to the last question.
First of all, forgive me, my hearing isn't really...
Oh, no problem.
My hearing isn't because I might have misunderstood something you said. So it's not any error on your part, my ears aren't working.
It's okay, don't worry.
There is a struggle going on, but yet in the book he sends to his brother the word chidush, something new. What are the insights that he is there transmitting?
No, I think that's an excellent question. What the rabbi is asking is, the title he gave to his sermons are Chidushei Torah, Tavshin Aleph, Tavshin Beit, Mishnot Hazam, right? Or Mishnot Hazam, and then the years. So Chidushei Torah, I'm not sure that's unique in the history of rabbinic literature. Lots of things are called Chidushei Torah, but I think what you're right is that in his mind, he understands that what I have to say here, in light of the fact that I've decided that this is unique, that there are chidushim here that no one else has actually said, and that need to be read, because they are chidushim, as you quite rightly pointed out, in response to this unique catastrophe. So I think that's an excellent point. And I would say even deeper than that is perhaps this is an addition to the canon of Jewish literature, of the long Jewish literature of responses to suffering. This should be added to the canon because of the chidushim. Yeah.
Okay, can I ask a question?
No.
Thank you. So I had one question. Then I thought, well, I'll ask that question, but that's not the question I want him to answer. It's the second question that I'd like you to answer. But I'm going to ask you the first question. So the first question is, in 1947-48, there was another important discovery made in the Judean desert, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And while that was a library, ultimately, that spanned almost 3 centuries and involved a very large community, it provided, obviously, a revolutionary understanding of early Judaism. Is there a way to think about this Oinik Shabbat library as something that potentially has the power and significance to change how we understood Jewish life in these horrible years? Now, that's not the question I want you to answer. You can,
But it's an interesting.
but the question I wanted to ask is really, I'm dying to see the book, and so.
So am I.
I'm dying to see the book, and I'd love to know. Could you share the table of contents with us? You know what?
Yeah, I could. Yeah, I didn't. I need to open my computer to tell you.
Is that okay? I mean,
Yeah.
Don't you want to know?
I can tell you what. You guys want to know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So let me just get up my table.
When this talk was scheduled, did you think it would be out by now?
You know what? I did think it would be out. Academic publishing is a nightmare. And they told me now, even though I handed in the final manuscript 6 months ago, they said 2027. So, okay, whatever. As long as I know there's a date. Sometimes it's worse than that. Let me just get this out.
That question ever before, so
Just hold
but I'm dying to know.
Yeah, you know what? Just hold on 1 second.
While you're doing that, really quick question. How did that guy kill himself? Suicide. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay, let me just give you, okay. So I have a general introductory chapter to this background that I was telling you about. I have a kind of a fairly long chapter on the general problem of the Shoah. So where I deal with all kinds of, we discussed this, like guys like Fackenheim, major kind of philosophers, thinkers, theologians, you know, that this kind of would be part of this, what we know as responses to the Holocaust. And so then I have a chapter called Annihilating Intellect, meaning I'm going to give you the chapter headings. Chapter called Thinking the Unthinkable, a chapter on Yiddish, which is, as I said, the sermons would have been given in Yiddish, and then when he wrote them down, they would be in Hebrew. But there are, in the Hebrew, he preserves in a number of places Yiddish. I decided to tackle this and try to understand why did he keep the Yiddish here. I have a chapter on the word Za'am. I have a chapter on Moses, so very often what he does is use biblical figures as models, right? So there's a chapter on Moses as a biblical figure that deals with suffering. Of course, Moses dealing with the suffering in Egypt and how he resolves that. And then there's a chapter on silence, a chapter on the deleted drashot that I showed you with those strike-throughs. There's a chapter on Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva, many of you probably know, one of the most famous martyrs, one of the most famous rabbis in the 2nd century of Judaism, one of the most famous Talmudic rabbis, but also perhaps the most famous martyr. And so, not surprising, he uses Rabbi Akiva in very startling ways, very, very startling ways. Actually criticizing Rabbi Akiva's martyrdom, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. And then there's another one on breaking into the inner chambers of God, where he uses a certain midrashic idea where God only cries when God wants to cry. He goes into his innermost chamber to cry over the suffering of his people, who of course he's causing, but okay, that's a different theological problem. Because if he cried externally and the teardrops would fall, it would destroy the entire world. So there is a whole theme that sounds kind of Christian, but we haven't. They took it from us because the early Christians were Jews, of suffering for sin, including or suffering for the Jews, including God's suffering. God suffers along with his people. Whether that offers comfort or not, I don't know, but it was something that he drew on. So that's a kind of a skeletal outline.
Thank you very much, Jim, for sharing that with us, and it only makes our anticipation and desire to have this come out even faster. Now, we're really grateful that you came from Toronto to be with us in this horrible weather you've enjoyed for the last 2 days. And, but we're really very, very thankful and grateful to you, and we'll probably never forget this. And we might be walking by a bookshop one day and see a cover of your book and say, I remember that guy, I'm going to buy that book.
Don't wait for the remainder.
No, but you know, we want to thank the Federation for preparing a nice reception for us. And they have those great cookies. I brought some plastic bags because I know everyone will leave manually, but I have plastic bags to take home. So we're very grateful, and we'll be able to talk to Jim a little bit more about his book or any other talks we have. But I also want to remind you that we're sort of in the middle of this Taubman year. And so I want to just remind you that we have some really additional interesting people. On the 22nd of February, Rachel Elior from the Hebrew University will be speaking on how the rabbis came to power, the ancient rabbis. And it's a very interesting argument that she'll make. And then later in the year, I believe in May, we'll have Pamela Miguel from American University on her new book, which is entitled Anti-Semitism, an American Tradition. And then finally, we'll end the year with Aviva Zornberg, who will
be speaking on Moses just before Shavuot. So that's very exciting. And Lee and I will probably have a surprise along the way, but all those events are on Zoom. So we have to get used to Zoom because in reality, Zoom is our future. And so we look forward to seeing you in February and then into the spring. So thank you for joining us today.